Hello and welcome to the Sprint 150 review. I'll give the overview. Harpreet will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Brandon on the platform. So this is the stats for the sprint. As you can see, the number of PRs opened and merged is down markedly this sprint. I attribute that to the fact that we're getting closer to the release of Kasparov and the downstream IBM release. And I think it's just more fragile at this point, so people don't want to mess things up. Hopefully we should see a pickup soon after the holidays. All right, in terms of number of the types of pull requests merged, many more bugs and bigger ratio of bugs to enhancements as, again, we finalize towards the Kasparov release. And this is the health status of the core repositories as well as the provider repositories. With that, over to Harpreet.
Thank you, Oleg. Hello, everyone. Total of 33 PRs were merged in UI repos. There were 7. I thought I changed that, but I think there were 7. That slide needs to be changed. I forgot to update that top line. Actually, there were 35 total PRs merged in the UI repos, and there were 6 enhancements, 17 bug fixes, and so on. Some of the main ones are listed here. With that, next slide, please. So the links on the summary screens inside the boxes were changed to be more visible. Previously, the text color was same in all the rows. The only way you could tell that they were clickable was by hovering over them, and the mouse pointer used to be changed. So now we have text color as blue for any of the rows that are clickable, which looks nicer.
Cool.
And next slide, please. A new node for Ovf Templates was added to the orchestration templates tree in the Catalog Explorer to show these types of read-only templates organized as a list view and to be able to view their summary screens. Next slide, please. Delete support was added to list and summary screens for physical storage records. Next slide, please. And the Control Explorer that used to have the profiles, policies, conditions, events, alerts, all unified within a single Explorer was split up into their own menus. This is the first step towards the exploration of Control Explorer elements, so we can enable deep linking of these objects in coming sprints. One more change with this PR was implemented is that users can now have RBAC access to these entities at the more granular level. Previously, they were all hidden RBAC features. And with that, over to Adam.
Thanks, Harpreet.
I think there's one more. Harpreet, is this one more?
No, this is from last sprint. I don't know. I deleted those. I'm not sure why.
Okay, we'll clean it up. No problem. Over to Adam.
There we go. Okay, so this sprint in the core, Dan fixed an issue with save inventory kind of silently failing if there are record validations. So we saw an issue with a user who had a nil GUID on his exe management system record, and it wasn't updating the last refresh time because the commit failed. But without raising an exception, it wasn't obvious that anything was wrong. So he changed it to raise exceptions on update if it failed validation, and so that's how we found out what the problem was, and now any future issues will be also easily detectable and fixed. So that was a nice change by Dan. Libor moved the provider tag mapping definitions out of hard-coded lists in core and into pluggable provider repos, so the lists of tag prefixes and categories of things that can be tagged, like containers or VMs or container nodes. Those are all now moved into the provider plugins, and we group those, aggregate them up to show them on the UI. So that was a nice checklist item on our pluggability checklist that Libor tackled. David has gone through and moved the Cloud Volumes UI over to DDF, at least at the provider level. I think the API and the UI are going to be following shortly, but now the actual form for creating Cloud Volumes is pulled from the different provider repos rather than having conditionals in the UI. He also went through and added pluggable auth key pair supports features, so all the different providers that support creating and deleting auth key pairs now have support features for all those options. Next slide. The AutoSDE guys updated their OpenAPI spec and also updated the client. Currently, this client is in the provider repo, and shortly they'll be extracting it out into a proper Ruby gem. We also fixed an issue with the refresh interval. It was the default 24 hours, but without an event catcher, that's a pretty long time. So we updated it to every 15 minutes, which is the standard for providers which don't have an event catcher. For IBM Cloud, we are now catching failures when you have an invalid API key provided and displaying a better error message. Before it was just showing you the exception that was raised by the API SDK client. And now we catch that exception and print out a nice message that's also translatable when you're adding and editing the IBM Cloud provider. We also refactored the VMware template operating system method to work with both instances and images. Since it was kind of duplicated between the two, we standardized on a single one. And for IBM Terraform, they fixed cross-linking to Azure VMs. The reference that we were getting back from Terraform for the Azure VM didn't match what we're saving in the UID EMS column, and so they're doing some parsing on that so that it cross-links correctly. They also added an icon for the IBM Terraform provider vendor, I believe. So if we couldn't detect the proper vendor, it falls back to using just IBM Terraform as the vendor icon, and that's that one. Next slide. For Openshift, this is sort of a prelude to refactoring how we're doing subclassing for the container manager. But we found that there was a useless container manager mixin. It was basically inheriting from the Kubernetes container manager mixin, but it was only being included by a single class. So we just got rid of the mixin, moved the content into that class. For the Openstack side, they fixed a bug where a targeted refresh of a cloud network that we were processing, where that cloud network had been subsequently deleted, but we hadn't processed the event yet. It was blowing up and causing the refresh to fail. So now it's properly skipping missing networks by the time we go and process a targeted refresh of a cloud network. And on the vSphere side, we are now fetching the EMS ref for a VM network. So distributed virtual networks were always processed at the EMS level, but the old style standard VM networks, we actually have per host, and they don't map one-to-one with the managed entity on the VMware side. So we had to play some games to look up the EMS ref based on the name and the data center that it was in. But this is important for us to be able to assign networks when provisioning Ovf templates from content libraries. And so we're now looking up that EMS ref and saving it in the LAN record. And Lucy also added the ability of specifying a data store when you're deploying an OVF from a content library, or it was just picking whatever default data store was on the host, and now the user can actually specify which one. And that is it for providers. Over to Brandon.
Thanks. So this sprint, there were 33 PRs merged across the platform space. So we'll call out a few enhancements here, where Keenan ensured that product features are refreshed on all servers when tenants are created or updated. That's because there are certain product features that are tied to tenants, be refreshed when there are new tenants. Joe V enhanced the appliance console by adding the ability to configure a Kafka server and also configure other appliances to point to that Kafka server. This is part of a large effort to reduce the churn on our queue in Postgres. So there's more to do before we depend primarily on Kafka as a messaging system, but this is a big step in that direction. In Codified Yansa, The server GUID was stored only in an env var on the orchestrator pod. So in Kasparov, we moved that to the server GUID being stored in RCR. Unfortunately, this required some manual intervention during upgrade to fetch the GUID and store it in the custom resource. So I opened a PR to automate that process if an orchestrator pod exists. Joe R. was working on an issue regarding orphaned worker rows and added some logic to identify worker pods, which enables the cleanup of old worker records so that they don't keep building up in the table there. As far as bugs are concerned, Adam fixed a bug where systemd workers could end up in a failing restart loop if it died unexpectedly. He also ensured that failed systemd units get cleaned up. I switched our Kubernetes deployments from rolling to recreate strategy because we noticed an issue during upgrade where it was preventing some new pods from coming up. This was primarily found on Postgres, where there's a PVC attached, and the new one can't start until the old one releases the PVC, and the old one wouldn't go away until the new one is started. So we were stuck in a waiting loop there. And Jovi and Adam worked on an issue that presented as Google has no compute service, but that was caused by a discontinued gem for libsodium, so we switched over to a different gem and an RPM for that. Next slide, please. Dan Hawkins added some documentation for the IBM Cloud VPC provider and IBM Terraform provider. Dan and Lieber also fixed a few bugs in both the rendering and content of our documentation. And on the build side, Jason added more information to the manifest, making it easier for us to determine what code is in a build. This is especially helpful for troubleshooting in container environments. And Satoshi fixed an RPM dependency issue with the source of our overt Ansible content. Next slide, please.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Harpreet. And thank you, everyone. The sprint 151 will be in 2 weeks, but it'll likely be a shortened sprint due to the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday in terms of how many people are going to work on things for the next 2 weeks. And with that, I'd like to thank all the contributors, all the pull request reviewers, and all the presenters. And we will see everyone in 2 weeks. In the meantime, to everyone celebrating, happy Thanksgiving, and stay safe. And we will see everyone in 2 weeks. Thanks.